never repine. Merely to him I pray, thy will not mine. Oh, I love my Savior too. Oh, I love my Savior. He loves me too, he loves me too. I see his favor in everything I do.
Amen. Good morning. It certainly indeed is a blessing to once again be assembled here in the house of the Lord with another opportunity to study a portion of his holy and divine word. And as always is indeed our prayer that hopefully something is said this morning that you'll find to be beneficial and thereby be to apply to your life and be a better Christian and a better person in the future. We're certainly mindful of those of our number that are sick and shut in. We want to remember them in our prayers. The opportunity presents itself throughout the week where you may be able to go by and give them a call or visit them. I'm sure they'd be happy to hear any words of encouragement that you may have, as well as those that are mourning the loss of their loved ones. We want to continue to pray for them as well. We have another interesting lesson this morning. What is the subject of our lesson this morning? A church that sets an example. Our lesson text is found in the book of Acts, the 25th chapter, starting at verses 1 through the 26th chapter, verses 32. And then we have our key verse. Someone want to read that for us, please?
Paul replied, short time or long, I pray God that only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains.
As Acts, the 26th chapter, and verses 29. So we find, if we look at Apostle Paul's life, we find him talking about and giving us many examples of what a Christian should be like. In fact, but the lesson today is one that's focusing on a church that sets an example. And as I was studying this lesson, I recognized or realized Apostle Paul gave us an example of a church that sets an example. So I want to read those scriptures there for you. So Paul speaks about such a church in 1 Thessalonians, the first chapter, starting at verses 2 down through verses 10. And notice that he says, we always thank God for all of you and continually mentioning you in our prayers. We remember before our God and Father your work produced by faith, your labor prompted by love, your endurance inspired by hope in our Lord Jesus Christ. For we know, brothers and sisters, loved by God, that he has chosen you because of our gospel came to you not simply with words, but also with power, with the Holy Spirit and deep conviction. You know how we lived among you for your sake. Now, I want you to see some things here. First of all, that Paul is sharing with us. Notice here that faith produces love. Faith produces work. You see, so if you have faith, then it's going to do something. And it's going to produce work. So we can very quickly see whether or not, or examine ourselves to whether or not we have faith or not. Because if we have faith, it's going to cause us to what? To action, right? Because when there's work, there's what? Action, right? And then we see something else Paul shares with it. He says that if you have love, love prompts you to do what? To work. You know, we wonder, you know, and as I was looking at this and looking back at what Paul was saying here, and I started thinking about a number of things, and I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. But when we look at people today, and one of the things that people talk about is people's unwillingness to work. Well, maybe part of that unwillingness has to do with something where people are not either being loved or loving. Because if you have love, it'll prompt you to work. And then we find also Paul says hope. Hope inspires, or hope endures, right? It inspires endurance. So if you have hope, you can do what? You can patiently wait. That's what he's saying to. And so those things, if you will, were some things that this church was known for. There's a couple other things this church was known for, but I wanted to make sure I mention this to you also, because I think it's important that we look at this. Notice here, he says, down level, he says, our gospel came to you not simply in words only, but it came with what? Power. You see, the gospel has power. And we're going to look at some of that power today, and we're going to see some of those things that have happened. But I want you to think about what good is a gospel for you or to you if it doesn't have, or it lacks power. You see, so we need a gospel that has power, right? But watch what Paul says a little bit about. He says, and I want you to see this. So anytime you look at these things we talk about, when we talk about faith, and we talk about love, and we talk about hope, those are things that talk about you looking at something greater than just yourself. We're living in a time where we are so focused on just ourselves, we'll self-indulge. When we think mainly about ourselves, what's in it for me? How is this going to help me? But we need to look at a time and think about, and look at, as we look at Paul, we're going to see Paul was working for something that was greater than him. He was working for a greater good. And we find that Christ also offers us a greater good. So think about, keep that in mind as we talk about this lesson today. And then Paul goes on to say, in the rest of the verses, he says, you became imitators of us and of the Lord. Notice that. Imitators. Now, what's an imitator? Somebody that looks like, right? Or something that looks like, or is what? It's another version of it, right? He says, so you became imitators of us and of the Lord, for you welcomed the message in the midst of severe suffering with joy given by the Holy Spirit. And so you became a model to all that believe, all the believers in Macedonia and Asia. The Lord's message rang out from you not only in Macedonia and Asia. Your faith in God has become known everywhere. Therefore, we do not need to say anything about it, for they themselves report what kind of reception you gave us. They tell how much you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who rescues us from the coming wrath. So notice something here. When the church sets the example, you don't have to, that example then is known everywhere. People, and you remember last week we talked about what are we known for. People know what you are known for. They know about you. How do they know that? They tell that by the things that they have heard and the things that they have seen you do. And this is what Paul said. And notice something about this church. He says, you know, when you do that, when you have the faith in God you're supposed to have, guess what? They know about it everywhere. It's not something that's quiet or kept in the secret, but it's known everywhere. Our parents gave us real life examples of faith, hope, and love. You know, I had a great time the other evening visiting for a short period there with Brother Snow and Brother Price and Brother Gardner, and we were sitting there reminiscing about our past. And as I was thinking about this lesson, I was looking at that, and I felt so good listening to Brother Price talks about when he was a little boy and when he was first leaving home and all the hope and all the aspirations his father had for him. And I was thinking to myself, I couldn't help but to think, and I said it to them, I couldn't help but to think about how much faith our foreparents had to have to be living in the situation in which they was living, and yet they could see afar off us accomplishing the things that many of our sons and grandsons have accomplished in our lifetime. It's amazing. They was in a world, or they were living in a world where you could say they had no reason to have hope. They were in despair. Yet, somehow or another, they had faith in God. They had a trust in God that someday things would be much better. And as a result, they gave us that love that we needed. You see, as a child, I received ample love. And as I look around in our society today, and I look at how the kids are being raised, many of these kids, they're not being loved by anyone. And so it's no wonder when we see them, we hear about them doing all this shooting and all these things going on. It's no wonder they don't love anybody, because they probably themselves haven't ever really felt love. And so we think about one of the things that we can offer, it should be what? Love. It's so easy to criticize. It's so easy to want to ostracize and to tear down and to talk about these young men and women. But have we ever reached out a branch of love to them, to let them know that there is a God of love still alive? I hope y'all getting some of this lesson here. Brother Gordon, go ahead. That's right. And you remember, and I'm glad you brought that up because of the fact that it reminded me of something. Many of you are old enough to remember when there was, I'm trying to think of the name of that organization, but anyway, Jesse Jackson had an organization, and he used to call it, and one of their mottos was, keep hope alive. The Rainbow Coalition, right? And it was keep hope alive, right? And the reason why I say that is because, you know, hope is so important. And so we should, and I'm going to get a little bit more into this in a few minutes in this lesson, because I want you to see this, but it's so important that we look and we have an example, or we present hope to a dying world. That's what we're here for. We are to be that hope. In fact, I'm going to get on into the lesson, and I'm glad you brought that out, brother, but watch Paul here. He's an example of Paul's examples of hope. You see, so in Acts the 26th chapter, verses 4 through verses 8, look at what Paul says. He said, the Jewish people all know the way that I have lived ever since I was a child, from the beginning of my life in my own country and also in Jerusalem. They have known me for a long time and can testify, if they are willing, that I have conformed to the strictest sect of our religion, living as a Pharisee. And now it is because of my hope in what God has promised our ancestors that I am on trial today. That is, the promise of our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they earnestly serve God day and night. King Agrippa, it is because of this hope that these Jews are accusing me. Why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead? You see, Apostle Paul was talking about what? The resurrection. And even though this period of time we find they kept accusing him, they kept bringing him to a courtroom, and they making up all types of accusations and all types of charges, but all he kept going back to was the power of the resurrection. You see, he needed them to see the resurrection. What we need to do, a lot of times we get distracted and get off on a lot of things. What we need to be presenting to folks is the resurrection. The power of the resurrection. That power, it should see something in us. They should see that power in work in our lives. They should see what the resurrection has done in our lives. And so Apostle Paul continued reminding them, he said, it's because of this hope. This is why I'm on trial today. They can bring up all these other things, but it's because of this. And I like this, and he said, I have, and if you read those scriptures, all of those, the 21st, 25th, and the 26th chapter, you find that he says, I'm not guilty of any of these things, but the one thing I am guilty of is believing in the cross. And see, that's the thing we need to be guilty of. We need to be guilty of the resurrection. We need to be like Apostle Paul here is. And look at what and see, here's why Paul was like that. What it does for us and what the resurrection does, it has the power to change lives. We want to change things. We want to change lives. We got to go back to the resurrection. You see, you remember Paul did, and if you remember, again, I'm cutting this because I can't read all these scriptures, but I want you to read these scriptures. When Paul was talking to them, he told them about how he was one that went out and how he persecuted the church. He was the one that was the event. He was attacking Christians. But on the road to Damascus, he was stopped. He was stopped in his track. But that wasn't good enough. God didn't just stop him, but God changed him. He changed his life. He went in from being a pursuer of those who was in the way to being a leader of those in the way. He went from being a prosecutor to being a preacher. Notice something. God changed his life. And guess what? He was not ashamed of it. And he wanted the world to know how God had changed, and it was the resurrection that changed him. We should want people to know how God changed our lives. And if God hadn't changed your life, then you need to go and have a checkup. Because something is not right if you haven't changed. If you've been to the cross and you the same thing, you do the same thing, and you have the same person, and you always want to go the same thing, then something is wrong. All right, Anthony. You had to go get a checkup. I love you too, Anthony, right? So we need to find out, and so what we have to present to the world is that change in us. God wants to use us to show. Paul said, well, man, when God first told Paul to go to the Gentiles, he said, these people know me. They know how I have persecuted. He said, that's the reason. I'm paraphrasing here now. He said, that's the reason I'm using you. I want them to see the power. That's why I want you to go. And I need you to go, and I need you to go to the Gentiles. And I need you to set them free from sin. Can you imagine what it must have looked like to those people? In fact, Paul, one of his biggest, if you read it in the further, one of his things he used to love, I shouldn't say love, that's the wrong word, but one of the tactics he used to use, he used to make Christians blaspheme God. And so you can see, and he would trap them so that he could have them brought up on charges. So you could see them being suspicious of him coming and thinking he's doing these things to bring me up on charges. But God had turned his whole life around. And so much so that now this same man who used to persecute others is being persecuted. We find him as he's talking here at this time that he has been beat literally almost to death for his belief in that. Share something else with you right here. I love this, and Vince he preached a sermon on this. I don't know if y'all remember this, but he talked about but now. Right? You see what Paul recognized, and what Paul, when he was talking to the church in Ephesus, he says, he wanted them to understand. He said, you were in the world without God and no hope. Now let's think about it. Let's look at that for a minute. Think about it. And I know some of you have been in a situation before where you've been in a situation where you really thought that you had no hope. And how that must have made you feel. And how you must have thought when there was no hope. In fact, I can remember as a little boy hearing my mother when things was really bad. I knew when things were really bad because she would start singing a song. She would start singing, he would make a way somehow. And she would just sing that song. And I don't know what was going on, but I know whenever she was singing that song, somewhere or another, things always worked out. So you can't tell her, or you couldn't tell her about how good God was, because she would tell you how good God was to her. And so people are looking for us to show them God. But yet we act as if God has never done anything in our lives. Huh? He has never changed anything. It's like we always had it made. We ain't never had no problems. We ain't never had something that we didn't know how we were going to get through, how we were going to get around, how we was going to make it. In some way and somehow, God made a way. Don't we serve a good God? Huh? Yes, ma'am. And that's correct. And so our first responsibility to our children is to love them. You see, some of the problem that we face, and that's why we want to see some of this, and we're going to get to that one in just a little bit. And I appreciate you coming, but I want you to understand, and because, yes, we have a big responsibility to our children, because we are some of the first folks to share with them what an example of a Christian should be. And that's what Paul went in. In fact, if you remember, Paul would look at all the churches. He looked at them as being what? His children. Because he cared deeply for them. And which shares with us. And I'm gonna come to the love in a minute. But I don't want to get past this hope. But I appreciate you coming because I want you to understand, and I want us to look at, and I want to think about how difficult it's for kids. If you think about a little kid, if you will, that doesn't have any hope. And think about what the world must look like to them. Why should they have respect for anyone? Why should they care about how things go? They're living in a world without hope. They don't have to. So why should they worry about pulling their pants up? They don't have any hope. Why should they pay attention in school? No hope. So that's why we have to be people who are known for providing hope. So when they come here, they ought to see what hope looks like. They ought to understand. Anybody ought not leave here not saying, I have seen hope and I know what hope looks like if we are children of God. That's what. And we begin by showing them and sharing with them the power of the resurrection. Because the power of the resurrection changes. And so we all be able to tell people how God has changed our life. And that's what Paul continued to do here. The whole time that he's being on trial, he continues to make them aware of how God has changed his life. What a powerful example for us. Here's the second one, faith. Paul gives us an example of faith. In Acts, the 23rd chapter, verses 11 and verses 24 and verses 27, notice something else. You see, when Paul was in prison and they was doing all type of things to him and had, as I told you earlier, listen, God came here and said the following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, you must also testify in Rome. Now, notice what Jesus said, or what God has told Paul. He testified about God. He testified about specifically the resurrection. He said, just like you told the people in Jerusalem about the resurrection, you're going to also tell them in Rome. So you say, well, Brother Brown, where's the patient? Well, Paul is telling us, but now guess what? In verses 27, we see when 2 years had passed, Paul been in there 2 years. And I want you to go back. I can't read all this. They went, and every time they had a court hearing on Paul, they said, we found nothing. But they wouldn't let him go. In fact, Felix wanted a bribe from him. They wanted him to do certain things. But Paul, 2 years later, is still sitting here telling that, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but we find him testifying, telling that same story 2 years later. Same story. Over and over again. Somebody sometimes say, well, that story gets old. Well, the story of the resurrection never gets old. You see, if you had a real meeting at the cross, and if God has really changed your life, the story never gets old. You can't wait to tell it. And every time you tell it, it's like telling it anew for the first time. We find Paul here 2 years later telling folks the same story. Can you imagine? I just now reading this, I was thinking, I can imagine Paul being in prison and him sitting there and he's being around, see, because we don't think about this, and the Bible doesn't talk about this, but I can imagine, because if he lived in a world like we live today, there had to be some skeptics there. And there had to be some people sitting in prison with Paul saying, man, you've been telling that same story. It ain't nothing happened. You still sitting here just like I am. Yes, ma'am. That's true. If they were, and you're right in what you're saying is so true. If they were looking for the truth, if they were looking for justice, but they wasn't. Now, what they were looking for was some money. They were looking for to do the Jews some favors. But what it shows, and what you said is so true, but what it does show, it shows Paul's faithfulness. How long can we tell the same story? Some of us, when we first obeyed the gospel, we couldn't wait to go out and tell somebody. And we went and we told people. But then we got tired. But then something changed. And now we hardly tell the story. We hardly get excited about the story. We were just like the lady that I think it was, I think Vince talked about the lady the other day when he said, there was a lady that said she ran after he had met Jesus and said, let me tell you about a man. She couldn't wait to go tell people, let me tell you about a man. When we obey the gospel of Christ, then we run and tell people, let me tell you about a place. Let me tell you about the church. What happened to the story? But Paul's faithfulness is showing that still he's telling that same story. Watch this, y'all. In the 25th chapter, verses 10 and 11, watch what Paul says. Paul answered and said, I am now standing before Caesar's court where I ought to be tried. If I had not done any wrong by the Jews or to the Jews, as you yourself know very well, if, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving of death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me be by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. Now, before what had happened was that, now after Paul had already been tried, and after he already found guilty, then now here come Festus, and so he comes and he asks Paul after he had tried Paul and had the trial, and Paul gave him information. He come and asked, say, will you be willing to go back up to Jerusalem to do this with me and have a trial there? Why he got to go back to Jerusalem and have a trial? We didn't have the trial. But Paul full well knew of what? The plot. So Paul says what? I got to go to Rome. You see, my place is in Rome. I know it's been over 2 years, but I'm still headed to Rome. Paul never forgot where he was headed. We forget where we're headed, right? I know it's been some years since I obeyed the gospel, but I'm headed. And I got to keep telling this story because I got to get there. And I got to tell this story all the way there. Yes, ma'am. That's right. That's right. Once he had made a knowledge, that's right, that he was a Roman, right? And so once he appeared to Caesar, they had to what? Take him before Caesar. But here's what's interesting. If you read the whole thing is, now after he's been tried and all these things, and he had asked an appeal to Caesar, then the governor says, but I don't have anything to write. I have no charges to bring him up on. I can't send him to Caesar to be tried with no charges. So that's why he brought old King Agrippa in there. and so as he's listening to Paul tell the story, and you get a chance, you go back and read this whole story. But Paul, he knew that King Agrippa was well aware of their customs, and he said, "I am so excited to get a chance to talk about this in the front of you, because you are expert on the law." And he was telling them all about the things. And after Paul had got through saying so many things, he got old Festus excited. He shouted. Now see, that's something. Wait a minute. Let me stop. I shouldn't even go there. That's all right. But he got him so excited that he shouted, "Paul, you must be made. You done lost all that studying you done done, all that you've been coming with here. You have lost your mind." That's why Paul says so. He says, so then King Agrippa, I was not. Well, first of all, I got a little bit here myself. But first of all, when Paul was talking about the vision and he was telling them what happened, he said, so then King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven. You see what Paul said? I want you to get, I know we went past sometimes some of those scriptures. But what he's saying is that when God gave me something to do, I wasn't disobedient. I did what I was told to do. I did what I was commissioned to do. The question we need to ask ourselves is, when God gives us something to do, are we doing what God would have us to do? Remember now, we said that love prompts work. You remember that? We're going to come back to that again, right? So now, and then because I got ahead of myself, let me go ahead and bring this other part. The king is familiar, he tells old Festus, he said, the king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice, because it was not done in a corner. What Paul said, ain't none of this been done. You see, I want y'all, I get excited and I have to make myself slow down here a little bit, but I want you to understand, God is not trying to keep this stuff a secret. So why are we keeping our Christianity a secret? God is not trying to keep what he has done in your life a secret. So why are you keeping it a secret? Why can't we acknowledge boldly? This is what Paul's doing. Paul said, I'm speaking freely. Because this wasn't done in the corner. He said, and the king full well knows what I'm talking about. Yes, ma'am. Good morning. It's going to show. That's right. Yeah, we want to, and somehow or another, for some reason or another, we want to keep things a secret. But God is needing us to let the world know that he has power. And he has the power to change lives. And if we want God to change the lives of those around us, we got to stop keeping these things a secret. We need to stop keeping them a secret. Paul example a little. I told you that, Paul. Let's go back to what we just said earlier. In our key verse, it says, Acts the 26th chapter, verse 29. It said, Paul replied, short time alone. I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains. Paul says that, now I don't want you all to deal and have to go through what I've been through. I don't want you to have to be beat like I've been beaten. I don't want you to be changed like I've been changed. But I have so much love for you that I'm willing to go through all those things because I want you to be just like I am. How are you, Paul? He said, I am wholly committed to the resurrection. I'm wholly committed to the cross. Are we committed? Are we committed? You know, love, that's what I was talking about earlier. You know, and I look at, and I know y'all get tired of me saying back in, but I look at the work that my mother used to do and how hard she would work and how all the stuff she would do. She did it. I just know she did it because she loved us. She did it for us. She wasn't doing it for herself. You say, how I know that? I could see her not ever hardly buying herself anything. Taking in the dollars she had to make sure we have stuff to go on a school trip, to go do this, to go do that. I can remember my mother doing all those things because of the love that she had for us. It made her work. And so that's why we used to, when Brother Dan would talk about the program we once had about the labor of love, it was about a program about people wanting to work, but it ain't forced work. Now, one of the things my mother used to hate, and you would get in more trouble with when she asked you to do something, and you got an attitude about it. You see, because if you love something, then it should be a desire, it should be a pleasure to do what you can. And you sitting up here mad because somebody asked you to wash dishes. What's your problem? You mad somebody asked you to pick up your clothes. What's your problem? That's when you will really get in trouble with her because it shows your lack of appreciation. It shows your lack of gratitude. It shows your lack of love. And as I said earlier, if you want these kids to get right, we need to start loving them. You need to show them true love, not this fake love, not this forced love. And if you're doing it because you're forced to do it, if you're doing it because you're mandated to do it, then you're not doing it for the right. See, that's what we miss. See, and God is not looking for us to be here this morning just because we're compelled to be here. But he wants us to be here because we have a desire and a love to be here. Yes, ma'am. That's right. In fact, me and the brother, I told you already, and he made it here now. We and Brother Price and others was talking. One of the things we talked about is that, now don't get me wrong, if you go and you take a can of them biscuits, you hit the table and break them biscuits out and put them out, I eat them biscuits. They good. But they ain't good as biscuits. When somebody takes some flour and they take some and they roll them out and they do all that, they ain't the same biscuit. And you ask yourself, what's different about them biscuits? Them biscuits got some love in them. You see, it got love in it. And that's what we don't. And that's why Brother Price and Brother Gordon was telling us some things about his growing up. But some of the things we were talking about is that, when those things that we had back then, we thought we had everything. What we didn't realize is because what our parents was giving us, it was given in love. And so it looked like all that other stuff. So you didn't know any better. You thought you had it all. And then now, because we give kids out of our abundance. See, that's the difference. Our kids don't understand. They don't understand. Our kids very seldom. I would venture to say now, there's some. I know there's some, but there's probably a few of us where kids go to the refrigerator and open up the door and there's not something in there. There's not something in there. And like I told you before, my kids, especially my grandkids, they can record before my even grandbaby, before she can even read or write. She can look, you can drive down the street, she look up and she said, "There's McDonald's." And that meant for you to do what? You got to stop and pull over. And she ain't too far from some of that stuff now. She still, whenever she go down the street, she wants what she wants. She tell you we need to go get this. But and I'm saying those things because, my parents didn't have those things. I didn't get to go to those McDonald's. But I had some of the best hamburgers and french fries that you ever could eat at home. Huh? And how I wished I had that now. You see, and it all has to do with love. And so we're looking at Paul here. Paul gives us an example of love. He goes out to these congregations. He goes everywhere to teach the gospel. And he's also shown his love in that while he was out, gone away in Asia, and all on his missionary journeys, he hadn't forgot about the condition of the brothers and sisters in Jerusalem who were being persecuted. And so he's taken up a collection. And he went back to Jerusalem to provide the gift. So how often do we think about those who have sacrificed so much and done so much for us that we might be in the position we're in today? That we might have the things and enjoy the things that we're enjoying today. Yes, ma'am. That's right. They are because we have so much. And as I said earlier, and so we need, if some of us can think back, if we just would think back, and that's why I understand it was so important whenever they used to share the stories over and over again. So people could understand. See, our kids ain't heard these stories. And now if you tell them a story, they don't believe it. Vince was telling me about how he grew up in row houses. And he was trying to explain it. He thought I didn't know what a row house was. See? So he was trying to explain it all to me like, I was trying to, I didn't want to tell him. I had to end up telling Vince, me and Price had to tell him, we old enough. We've been there. But see, kids won't believe that now. And then he said that when he told his son about it, and when they drove down the neighborhood, they couldn't stay in the neighborhood what Vince grew up in. They couldn't believe it was like that. Because they never seen it. We shielded it. We shield our kids from a lot of those things. And shielding them from them sometimes does them a disservice. Maybe sometimes we take our kids down here to like these little places down here where these kids are staying, where their mother had been kicked out because of being abused and all type of thing, and they don't have anything. Maybe we need to go to some of these shelters and see what's going on there. See how some other folks are living that don't have it like we have it. And I'm so glad that Brother Eric still does his visitation, because maybe we need to go to some of these places where people are in there. Now, I want to tell you something else, folks. Let me tell you something. You got to get tough when you go down some of these hospital places and look in some of these rooms and look and see what's going on in some of these rooms when they had a door open and see what situation some of these people in. You can't help but to think about how good God has been to you when you see some things some people live in. Yes, ma'am. You have to make it quick now because we only got a short period of time in our class. Wow. Okay. Because you was able to do all those things, and because that lady instilled something in you, look at how many people's lives you have touched, right? Yes, ma'am. So I'm gonna have to. So we're gonna have to get with you and hear some of your stories, because you got some great stories, right? But I got on it. But I only have so much time in this class, and so we have to keep moving, right? And so I don't want anybody to think I don't want to hear your comments. But I have to keep the class moving. So I want you to see something else here. I want you to see these three. You see, so we serve a God of hope. Paul calls him in Romans the 15th chapter. And so if we serve a God of hope, we must be a people of hope. In fact, Peter tells us that he's gotten us to a what? Lively hope. And so it's that hope that we need to be instilling in others if we're going to set a proper example as a church and a proper example as Christians. So one of the things that we need to do, we need to be presenting hope. And then God is a God of love. 1 John 4:8, we find that God is love. And so if we're going to be God, and John goes on to tell us in there that if we are children of God, then we have to be what? Children of love. We have to love one another, and we have to be able to what? To love those that know not God. To bring them into the gospel of light. This is what Paul talks about over in the 26th chapter. He said, God, or the 25th and 26th chapter, he reminds him, he said, God has sent me to the Gentiles to bring them to the light out of the darkness. That's what he said. So our job, God is want us to go and bring people out of darkness. That's what we should be. And then we find in 1 Corinthians, the first chapter, verses 9, that Paul said God is a God of faith. In other words, he's a God of faith. God is able to do everything that he is committed to do. And so we find that Paul talked about, and he asked him, how do you think, how do you see it to be impossible, back in Acts again? Why do we perceive it to be impossible that God can raise men from the dead? And so he's saying God is able to do that. And so that's what our hope is. That's what our faith is. We should be doing the things, and what should have us, our faith, what promote us to working, is the fact that we're expecting God to raise us up from the dead. Now, if you really want to be good, if you really want to be where you ought to be, then you will already say, you know what, Brother Brown, I've already died. Y'all didn't get that one, did you? I've already died. You see, I went down in the gravy water of baptism. That's when I died. And God raised me up anew. I'm just waiting on him to come back, because I've already been raised up. And no matter whether I'm in the ground or whether I'm standing and walking around, when he come back, I'm going to be like John said. I don't know what he going to look like, but whatever he come, I'm going to look just like him. And for that reason, I am working to get just like him. You see, so the reason we're here, folks, is God has given us just another chance, another opportunity to get it right. He wants us to get it right. That's why we used to sing the song sometimes, let's get right, church, and go home. God is giving us an opportunity to get it right. And the only way we can get it right is being a church that sets the correct example. And the example has to be one of faith, one of love, and one of hope. I've enjoyed this lesson. I hope you gained something from it. I appreciate it. Brother Gordon, I'm going to let you take over at this time.